What is amazing, however, is not that the church suffers from every kind of failing common to human beings, but that it is simultaneously still the primary instrument of God's work on earth.
Welcome to Reclamation Podcast, a beEmboldened initiative. This episode is going to focus on finding healthy community, and our very special guest today is Mary Jo Sharp. If you have not familiarized yourself with her, she is a former atheist who came to faith. She is now an assistant professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University and the founder and director of Confident Christianity Apologetics Ministry. She has been featured in Christianity Today's cover story, The Unexpected Defenders, and is an international speaker on apologetics, focusing on love and logic to uncover truth. She is the author of the top-selling Bible study, Why Do You Believe That?, as well as Living in Truth with Lifeway Christian Resources. She recently released her book, Why I Still Believe. For those of you who are new to us, new to beEmboldened, we exist for those impacted by religious trauma by providing support for prevention of victimization and revictimization, creating a safe space to ask questions and to heal. You can learn more and support this work and the resources we offer, which include support groups, virtual courses, healing-focused getaways, by visiting beEmboldened.com. This episode today is sponsored by Whitehaven Coffee Roasters. They are a small batch specialty coffee roaster focused on connecting with people over an exceptional cup of coffee. What sounds better than that? Go to whitehavenroasters.com. You just have to type Live Free into the note box at checkout, and then beEmboldened will receive a donation of 15% of your order. So thank you so much for your support. We really appreciate it. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a while. It is, and not because it's an easy one. Right? This is a tough conversation.
Yeah.
And yet oftentimes those tough conversations are the most important. So thank you for being here with me today and being willing to talk about this with me.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. So talking about, again, healthy community. And I chose those two words, healthy and community, thoughtfully, purposefully, because perfect and healthy are different. And a specific picture of church and community could also be different. So, Mary Jo, I know you've experienced firsthand the imperfection of the church. Would you please start us off on what this journey has looked like for you?
Yeah. So you were talking about my book, Why I Still Believe. And that was the journey that, I went through. So I'm going to try to sum up, a really long time in just a real short amount of time. My background is atheist, growing up in the Pacific Northwest without church or God in my life. And what I did grow up with was like an awe and wonder at the universe in which I lived. And I had parents who were attentive to, take me to a lot of culturally rich events, such as musicals and symphonies. And my dad loved to take me to museums, and we watched a lot of nature and science shows. So I think that really taught me to wonder. And part of that developed that sort of philosophical approach to life of, what is this all for? Does life have meaning, purpose, and value? And right at the time that I'm starting to ask these really hard questions about, am I just a speck of dust in a vast and different universe? Although as a kid, I'm not framing it that way, but I'm thinking, what else is there? Is this it? Right at that time, I have a Christian who's my high school band director, who's very burdened for me. And he hasn't shared his faith before. And he just wants to, he just can't get this out of his mind that he really needs to share with me. So my senior year of high school, before I graduated, he said, hey, when you go off to college, you're going to have hard questions. I hope you'll turn to this. So it was sort of a right timing, right? Listening to the Spirit, and that he hit me at the right time where I really needed something, and I started to read that Bible, and it brought me to this point of, oh, wow, I really need to go investigate this more. So I went off to college and I was investigating faith, like not purposefully to investigate faith, but I was beginning to go, hey, well, I could go check out church and do all this stuff on my own. And I think when I started, reading the Bible and reading what it said, I think it set my expectations pretty high in combination with the fact that I'm an idealist and a bit of a perfectionist already. So the ideals that I was seeing about love and how we're supposed to treat one another and, not act like our former, before we were saved, sort of lives, that were to press on towards Christ-likeness, which, that's the goodness of God himself. So I thought, coming into a community who adhered to this text, that I was going to find, the best people, like, who are committed to this sort of godliness and goodness and love and all that stuff I was reading about. And, I understood my need for salvation, so I trusted Jesus. But then coming into the church without that church cultural background and not knowing what to expect and having that sort of naive idealism about what I was going to find, it really threw me. And when I encountered a lot of hypocrisy in the church, judgmentalism, condemnation, and not just towards me, it was the observation of it on a whole. It really started to cause me to doubt, what is it that I've done? What did I say that I believed? Looking out, I'm not seeing a real commitment to God's word as actually supposed to have some kind of impact in our life. People say they're committed to it, but I'm not really seeing this like concerted effort towards this, like an intentional effort towards Christ-likeness. And it really impacted me to say, I wonder if this is actually true, or what. So I went through this time of trying to find answers to these big questions about, is God real? How do I know Jesus rose from the dead? Why do I trust the Bible? All of those sorts of things. But at the same time, I kind of had that undertone of, I really kind of hope this isn't true so I can walk away from it.
Peace out.
Peace out. Not have to deal with this community, and go back to my atheist friends, that former lifestyle, and just walk away, which, I was perceiving as liberating. But actually, what I found was that I actually believed in God. And a lot of the things that I believed were foundationally based in a Christian framework. And so I ended up not being able to walk away. And that was really, in some sense, heartbreaking. And in another sense, like, finally coming to the end of that part of the journey where I had to say, okay, I do believe this. Now what am I going to do?
Yeah. That makes me think of potentially a mutual friend of ours, Douglas Grotice, the way he is phrased, like, I know too much to turn away. And he's used it in different areas of his life, but I think about it in relation to being a part of a church community. That's I know too much to be able to just say, forget the church, I'm done. And I even know too much, and we'll talk about this more in a bit. I even know too much to feel like I can just say, forget the church, but I'm going to keep Christ. Like, I can't do that either. And that's where a lot of people go for quite some time. And so I'm excited again to talk about that a bit more, of why that doesn't last forever, can absolutely be appropriate. And sometimes I think even necessary. I would make an argument for that for a period of time. I'm not able to just kind of turn my back on everyone and be like, all right, it's me and God, and that's it. It's just the two of us against the world, because he's for more than just me.
Yeah. And that's a good conversation. It's one that's needed right now.
So it is incredibly difficult. Maybe I'm projecting, but I know I'm not for my audience. It can be incredibly difficult, feel impossible actually, for someone who has experienced religious abuse to be involved in any sort of community afterwards. So we're going to start there, particularly a religious one. It can go bigger than that. So for those of you who are listening, maybe you say, I do identify as atheist at this point in my journey, but you're still like, I don't know if I want to go be a part of the, that workout group, or a part of that, mom's group, or it can be anything. But we are more so focusing on a religious community at this point in this conversation. Identifying healthy is painful and confusing when any sign of imperfection is going to be a trigger. It's going to be a reminder of a previous grief. What are your thoughts on what a healthy church looks like?
Yeah, this one is really a tough question for me. I'm sure it is for everybody, because This one, instead of just wrestling with the theological or philosophical considerations of whether or not God's real or Christianity is true, this one is wrapped in the pain of experiential experiences, like my experiences with the church. So, and it's also difficult for me because for me, it's much easier to be, an apologist and just put arguments out there than to let you see, how I'm struggling with what a healthy church looks like. So there's a few things that I'll say I look for. And remember, it's coming from this sort of academic approach. So if it seems a little academic, I can't get past that. That's who I am. So I look for, one of the things that I think is really important in a healthy church is its general structure, that it's set up with the intention of promoting a compassionate accountability as well as human flourishing for everybody involved. And I don't know I don't think I've worked out exactly what that looks like or that it would even be the same in every situation. But I can say that one of the unhealthy markers is when the majority of power is in the lead pastor or senior pastor of the church, because I think that's setting that person up as well as that church up for failure. And when I say failure, like moral failures, abuse of power failures, it sets them up with too high of performatory expectations, which would lead to burnout. They also lead to placing their identity in their ministry position, which can then lead to an unhealthy neglect of family responsibilities and relationships and a lack of appropriate friendships. So I'm kind of looking for a structure that's designed with a more realistic perspective on fallen human nature.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes me think of from just say a secular business, because I'm by no means boiling a church down to business. But in a secular organization, they're looking at mitigating risk.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that, how much more does it matter when we're talking about a Christian community that we mitigate those risks, that they're likely to be pitfalls. We're likely to get hung up. That's why with beEmboldened, like I want the advisory board and the board of directors. And because what if I go rogue in 20 years? I don't foresee that. But like, what if God forbid something happens? You want to have it set up in such a way that people aren't going to be harmed. Minimal harm done to everyone, including leadership too. Yeah.
That's that recognition that we have. It's like, people are always talking about biblical Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. Well, we have a sin nature, we are fallen human beings. So to ignore that is perilous for, anybody. So that's the structure of how you're organizing the church is important to me, to promote that. It's actively trying to promote emotional health and wellness in your leadership as well as in the congregation. So there's several ideas there, and I can go on if you want me to. I have some here's what I'm looking for in this.
Yeah, I would love to hear more. I'm checking. I know I asked, how do you go out? Oh, no, I didn't actually phrase it this way. One of my notes I have is I'm curious how you go about identifying a healthy church for yourself. And I know that this overlaps. But is there anything else that you would add for you, maybe even more personally, if you're open to sharing that? Or there's certain things that you found really matter for you to feel safe and to think, okay, I can have some confidence here. And I caution people, this doesn't mean we ever shut our brains off. We always keep them on because we have that due diligence and that accountability for ourselves too. We shouldn't have to be super on guard, nervous all the time with everything that's being said and done either. There's kind of a balance there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the human flourishing with the recognition of the fallen human nature is what we're after. So things that I look for serving those purposes is that the church builds in rest, that there are built-in sabbaticals for leaders, that there's not an attitude of you always have to be here every time the doors are open for everybody. That's an unhealthy position because it's not sustainable for humans. So rest is an important part of that church's life. That again, active recognition of the reality of human leaders, that they are fallen. So there's no undercurrent of the lead person at that church being the boss. And you brought this up, and it was great because I was going to say that they do not operate within a strict American business structure, that the Christian ethical commitments always eclipse the business practice. Because I've been a part of churches where I have seen them go straight, it's just business. We even got told that by another minister. Well, it's just business.
Wow.
And I was like, no, it's not.
I mean, I appreciate the directness about their view. You don't have to dig for it, but yeah, I wouldn't be able to agree with that.
Right. Yeah, there's Christian ethical commitments that we're held to a higher standard of how we love one another. And that would mean within the structure of the church as well. So I also look for churches, I've asked for this for many, many years, and it's hard to find one, but that offer counseling services. One that, where you actually feel like you can be open with this person so that you can discuss the problems, that we engage as normal human beings throughout our life, or that they actively promote off-campus local counseling services. So I'm looking for that. And then as an indicator of just kind of their ethos, I'm looking for churches that actively care for the immediate community in which they're placed through all the kinds of things that we would imagine, like food pantry, benevolence, blood drives. But that's important. That shows you the heart of the church, that they do it out of the joy of their abundance. So those are some of the things I'm looking for. And I'm building, see my idealism, Naomi, see it? But I'm looking for that. I'm also looking for above average discipleship, that they push their congregation towards harder learning, that their desire is to create kingdom-minded people, not a local tribe of followers, kingdom-minded.
Yeah.
And then I'm also looking in the congregation to find believers who are not the same as they were 10 to 15 years ago. And that's a really hard one to gauge. But Christianity is not a spectator sport. So it's a commitment to intentional transformation. So if I'm not finding people who have gained anything significantly valuable to their own character after many years of being in this church, I'm inclined to think it might be emotionally unhealthy. And that's scriptural. James 1, be a doer of the word, not just a hearer, because that's deceiving yourself. So you have to actively be a doer of what Christ and the apostles and the writers are teaching you.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't thought about it in that way of, okay, this church has been, and it's different. Maybe if you have a church plant, of course, if you're a part of that, but the church has been around for a little bit, or the individual people have just been Christian for a little bit. It sounds like you're saying it's just individual, even if it's a church plant. Okay. We're people who are involved before, and if we can sit down and have coffee with someone or have a conversation, we can probably start to gauge that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, like I said, it's difficult. I'm idealist. So these are my ideals. Like you were mentioning, it's not going to be perfect. But we shouldn't use that slogan. Like, if you find a perfect church, don't join it because you'll ruin it. We shouldn't use that slogan because that's setting the bar so low. Like you should find, if God is real and Christ really died for us on the cross, so that we could, have right relationship with God and human flourishing, the abundant life, then we should see that in some way, in some demonstrable way, affecting people and affecting who they are personally, their character, how they're growing, how they're maturing over time. That should be a marker of a emotionally healthy church, is that people are maturing in their knowledge of God, yes, but also in their own emotional life.
You're right. It makes me think of that hospital metaphor that's used as well. Church, that it's a hospital, and in some ways, I would agree with that. People are able to come when they're broken. We're welcome, but I would agree with kind of what you added but we don't just all stay there. It's not, it's a hospital, so it's okay for me to remain where I'm at. No, we want to see people healing and growing and then getting trained to also be doctors and nurses to help other people who walk in who need a hospital. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if anyone who's listening to this has heard that, again, that analogy, but maybe there's a little bit more to it that we could add on.
Yeah.
Do you have an absolute must that you would recommend to people where like everyone needs to seriously consider this when beginning their own search? And it may be something you've mentioned already. I'm just curious if there's one that really would float to the surface to get somebody started.
Yeah. That for me personally, it goes back to who you're putting in leadership and the person that's calling themselves a pastor, which is a shepherd. It's not just a teacher, it's a shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking for a person who is open to correction and criticism. I'm really looking at like, who did this congregation say represents us and can really shepherd us? So I'm looking for that, like sort of a humble heart. And I've told my husband, as being an academic and being a public speaker, sometimes we can get into a little bit of snobbery, like sermon snobbery. Because I go out and I get to hear from some of the best people, the best speakers on the planet. And I've always told my husband that what I'm looking for is this genuineness to the person where you see they respect their family. You can see that they take the rest seriously, that they really love people in general, and especially non-Christians. There's a love there for them, and that they're a person who's generally respected in their community. I'm looking for that person who is actually giving pastoral care to their flock, who's acting as a shepherd, because I think that's for me, that's really important because, as you talk about people who've experienced abuse in the church, I think sometimes we need to see a person who's not the abuser, the person who's taking this calling very seriously, and actively trying to be that shepherd. And to grow themselves, if I've said that well.
Oh, yeah. I think you said it great. And it might highlight for people, I did just now for me, I'm like, I really prioritized the teaching because my doctrine was such a mess. Oh. And so that's my first thing is this solid teaching? Do we have sound theology? Are we practicing good exegetical skills, hermeneutic? Like, how are we doing here with the actual sermon and the teaching? But yeah, if we don't look at the shepherding part as well, then we're just kind of opening ourselves to being at risk for other forms of church hurt or harm, maybe even abuse, depending. So it is important to take a look at both. And someone else who's out there maybe has a different story than mine. And they're like, oh, I don't really pay attention to the theology. Well, that can land you in hot water too. So again, we got to look at all of it. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah.
What is your overall philosophy about being part of a church community, both from a theological standpoint as well as from your personal experience? So again, this is kind of for people who are, I don't know about this church thing. I'm really not sure. Like, what is sort of your take on why are you still a part of this?
Yeah, I think for me, so I'm going to do like a theological and then the personal. Mm-hmm. Theologically, God is community. He is Trinity. So the model for our way of being comes from our Creator. There's relationship at the base of reality. And that, for me, that's something not to be taken lightly. You have to seriously consider what that means. We have to wrestle with how the Creator's own nature of being three in one and having that relationship in community with Himself affects our view of being in relationships with others. And for me, that theological basis provides a basis that I need to be in community. I was made for community. Personally, it's hard. I'm a bit worn out from some of the great evil that I encountered in the church, specifically by those who would call themselves leaders in the church community. So trying to reconcile past experiences of these people who seem to be so callous and spiteful on a regular basis, and yet themselves called to the pastorate or to leadership. That's very hard for me. But I do recognize that part of being human the kind of thing that I am, is that I need human relationships. And, the human community is important. I mean, we can go to scripture where it talks about the body of Christ saying that the eyes cannot say to the foot, I have no need of you. When we put that more in the common vernacular, there are characteristics and qualities and skills and traits and knowledge and emotional development that others have that I don't have, or maybe I have them, but they're not as developed. And so these people who have these other things can add to, they don't have to be, I'm not talking about people who have arrived anywhere. They just have the things that I don't have that can help me. The community can help me get out of my head. So because they think in different ways. So they truly, being a part of a community can truly minister to me in ways I didn't even know that I needed until it's like happening, until I'm in relationship with people and going to get that coffee with them and they say something and I'm like, wow, I never thought about it that way. Just using different language for the problems that I'm facing. Sometimes I'm amazed that with all this study I'm doing, getting a PhD, that somebody will just pop something off, when we're hanging out, and it has so much insight that I didn't see. And it's because it's coming from a different place than from within my own head.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. Plus personally, there's a participation in that community of suffering. And that goes back to that our Savior suffered for us, that he, the Isaiah 53 passage, Jesus is acquainted with grief. He's a man of sorrows. And while he has a uniqueness in that we don't have, as being, fully God, fully man, there's a model there in that kind of care for our soul. That comes about when we understand that our sufferings are not unusual or like cruelly specific to us as individuals, but that there are those around us who have suffered in similar ways. And that's that community of suffering that provides a certain kind of unique care for the soul. But I don't just want to focus on the anguish of living in this world. I need community and relationship because it's a community of flourishing. And Christians don't always do this one well, but Christians are supposed to encourage one another. And, like the Romans 12 passage says, we're supposed to rejoice with those who are rejoicing, as well as grieve with those who are grieving. So there's an encouragement and a joy that's supposed to be there from seeing fellow like-minded believers flourish, even in spite of the world in which they live.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. There is both. And I think when we are talking about beEmboldened stuff, we're talking about religious abuse, it's a lot of the suffering side of it. And I know I share in my own story, and I know you talk about it in yours. There's a beauty that comes out as well. And there's hope. And there are usually moments, maybe all connected to people, for some people, often not. But there are exceptions to these rules we maybe create in our head. And that can fall into this idea of like confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance. So where, there's another person who looked at me wrong, or there's another person who was genuinely rude. Like, gosh, that was not an okay way to respond to me. There's another person that didn't have integrity in their word and they just backed out like it was no big deal, even though now my family's turned upside down. So, all these things that can happen, be like, oh, well, there's another story that piles on and piles on and piles on to this narrative that has been created out of something, wasn't just made up, but now it's getting piled on. Well, let's not forget the exceptions. Let's not forget the kindness that someone showed us. Let's not forget the person who sat with us and was present with us in pain, the person who reached out and offered a meal, a helping hand of some kind. So we want to make sure we put it all together, or we can get really, really bitter about it, because people are going to let us down. In the church and outside of the church, people are going to disappoint us and they're going to let us down. But not everyone lets us down and disappoints us every time. So it's kind of putting that all together. And something that really stands out to me is it does kind of turn the magnifying glass back on myself. And we can think of, the idea of removing the plank from our own eye before we go look at the speck and, yes, remove the plank, please don't actually leave it there, like actually handle it. And it has really impacted me to want to be more of a friend for people in the communities I'm a part of, to be more open, to be more, hey, you can join, more open door, because I want that. Be like, yeah, you're welcome. Like, come join, and wanting to be more available, making sure that when I tell someone I'm going to pray for you, I actually do it. I actually pray for them, because otherwise it's just a platitude, and that's a terrible thing to have be a platitude. So I think there's benefit there as well. And I'm wondering, I've had this thought before myself, what I'm about to read off to you. I've had this thought for myself. I'm like, why am I bothering? Like, what is the point? And so to put it very directly and succinctly and kind of boil it down for anyone else who also has that thought of like, what is the value in bothering to figure this community thing out? Why not just let it go and be myself when it comes to my faith? Now, maybe I have a job or I'm a part of a sport or whatever that looks like. But when it comes to my faith, I'm just going to do this alone. Forget it. It's not worth it. What would your response be?
So many things.
Can I join you? No. But then you're not alone.
Yeah. So the thought that I have constantly on this is that the vision of redeemed community given by Jesus, and also you see it from the apostles, specifically Paul, that they have a vision of what it's supposed to look like to be in Christian community. And I really think that one, I'm going to quote Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings. I think it's worth fighting for.
Of course you're going to quote whomever that is.
I love Lord of the Rings.
I was like, him, her, it. I don't even know what pronoun to use. I have no idea.
Sam is Frodo's good buddy, and Frodo's the hero of the story.
My husband is so embarrassed right now. Let's see. He's ashamed of me. Go ahead.
I don't know. I mean, if it's not your thing, it's not your thing. It's okay. No shame involved. This is my thing. I love fantasy. So, but yeah, so I think that vision is there very distinctly over and over in the Bible of a redeemed community. In fact, what you were saying is kind of along the lines, well, it is actually exactly along the lines of what Jesus was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, like in Luke 6, when he says to love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you. Part of that, and the reason not to just brush by that, is that I think he's talking to us about how we live in the redemption he brought, how we live redemptively in a world full of evil. Because if we were to only do good to those who did good to us, we would probably never do good. Because if you think about sin, like the old Billy Graham statement, how often do you sin? And he's like, well, probably once every however many seconds, he said. So that potential of you just have to be able to do good to those who aren't doing good to you. That's the vision. That's the redemptively living, knowing that this is not going to always be given back to you. And Jesus is he's very open about that. Like, what good is it if you're just doing good to people who do good to you? And he says, the phrase that we have in the English Bible is even the sinners do that, right? Even the sinners do that. So basically what he's saying is you're called to something harder, which is to live in that freedom that he's bringing. And that means you're free to do good. And that's hard. And there's a quote that I want to share, which it's a little bit lengthy, but it's from Daniel Taylor's book, The Myth of Certainty. And it kind of goes along with what you said earlier. His subtitle is The Reflective Christian and the Risk of Commitment. Oh, yeah. So here's what he had to say. He says, the supernatural potential of Christians laboring to establish the kingdom of God together is so great that the reality of life in the typical church is both depressing and comic by comparison. The church is easily ridiculed, and in its institutional form deserves much of the abuse it receives. And then he says, what is amazing, however, is not that the church suffers from every kind of failing common to human beings, but that it is simultaneously still the primary instrument of God's work on earth. That is a good summation of why it is I believe in the vision of redemption here and now that Jesus brought to us. Live in this. And that's why I'm bothering with community, because I don't know that vision is possible alone. He's talking about being there for each other. And that's hard. That's very hard, especially when that vision has not been your experience in the church.
Right. It's kind of like I had mentioned to someone recently, marriage is hard. And the person's response was, they've got a couple decades of marriage on me. And they're like, my marriage is actually, they're like, I feel kind of bad saying this because it's usually not people's story, but my marriage has been like easy. Now, other aspects of life have not been. So it's not like they got a total, go pass go, don't go to jail. They didn't get the whole total like free card. But that would really stand out for me with church if someone was like, I've just had, and once in a while I hear it, like, I've just had the most amazing, blessed, life-giving church experience my whole life. It is wonderful, glorious. Talk about God on earth. I really see it and feel it there. Usually I'm hearing, no, like it's tough, but there's good in it. There is good to be found. There's goodness to be found, but we might have to look for it.
Yeah.
It might not just hit us in the face.
You might have to be it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yes, absolutely.
That's the hard one, is like, I'm looking for it. But years ago when I told my husband, like, where are the leaders? Where are the people that are doing what's right? Where are the guys committed to the ethics of Christianity? And he said, Mary Jo, you might have to be the leader you're looking for. Like, you might have to do that. So that's another thing to consider. Yeah.
And I want to put a little asterisk here and comment for those of you who are listening who may accidentally yet understandably be equating this to like your religious abuse experience. I want to make sure that you hear us. We are not saying that you stay in an abusive situation. So I want to put that out. That's not the same as what we're talking about. We're talking about kind of the day in, day out of being a part of a relationship, that kind of ebb and flow where it's challenging, it's hard, and people can be rude and they don't do what they should do. And we're struggling with that. And it's correct that we're with that. We're seeing the fallenness and the lack and the disparity between us and the Trinity of what it's supposed to look like. We're feeling that in a very real way. We're not saying that if you are in an abusive situation, well, you go be the better one and you stick it out and try to turn it around. So, Mary Jo, I know you're not saying that at all. Just like the way some people may hear it, depending on where they're at, I want to say it very directly.
Yeah, I'm glad you caveat. I had a caveat, but it was later.
Okay. Hey, we have to.
We might caveat it again, but no, it's so important because there is a certain way of framing things from a pulpit that still, because of my bad experiences, that I still have that visceral, like emotional reaction when I hear it in a certain way. And I have to tell myself what's happening. So yeah, definitely want to have that caveat. We're not saying we're not saying to stay in a situation where you're being abused.
Right. Yeah. The most common response I hear to an individual who has experienced religious abuse is to get plugged in with a church. So that would be like the initial response. Someone says, this is what I've experienced. It's like, you need good Christian community, getting plugged in with a church. So with all the respect I can muster in response to this, I do see it as a tone deaf answer. I understand why someone would say that because of the value of church community, like you've just shared. But it's typically unrealistic and therefore it's unhelpful at that time. Yeah. I would also, like I mentioned earlier, make an argument that it's potentially dangerous, as this person is highly unlikely to be equipped to discern a sound environment yet from one that's problematic. And therefore, they'll either choose a similar environment to what they came out of, or one that has swung so far in the other direction that they've landed in a whole other set of problems. As a comparison point, if I'm talking about someone who is in a fundamentalist cult, not just fundamentalist, I'm saying like a cult that is in a more fundamentalist area, but twisted doctrine, all that stuff, they come out, they're most likely then going to go towards a prosperity gospel, progressive Christianity, the New Apostolic Reformation, because it's really swung in a different direction. I have a couple of questions connected with this that I'd love to get your thoughts on. The first one, why do you think individuals who share about their religious abuse are sometimes seen as being sinful and in need of rebuke? Like, hey, you need to get in church. This is what needs to be happening. You're not living out what you should be living out. So you're kind of getting in your own way, maybe, so to speak, instead of being seen as victims in need of care. For example, it can be asserted that the only possibility is that they didn't like what they heard. So that's one example that I have experienced on behalf of others.
I'm going to generalize a bit here from my own experience, and I just want to make sure that the listeners understand that. So in my own experience, a person responds inappropriately to an accusation of abuse by a victim because they themselves have little to no experience in responding to the deeply upsetting evil in the world. That's not something that they spent a lot of time thinking on. So they have a limited understanding. Now, sometimes that's situational. They just never have had to deal with it. Sometimes people just like it that way. It's easier. The people who, I shouldn't really say like it, they kind of want to keep it that way because then it's really under their life, feels like it's under their control. But then that can lead to what I'm going to call easy bake oven Christianity, where you pop in a problem and you pop out an answer. It's kind of like a sitcom, 30 minutes and everything's solved.
Yeah.
But that's not how real life works. So just sort of gaining a better understanding, like even from the scriptures, the Bible talks about how generations suffer from the sins of the past. And it doesn't just talk about it, it reports that, how people are affected by the great evil at the hands of others, generationally even. So I think gaining a better understanding of that will help a person respond more compassionately to people who have been victims. And then, I'm going to step on a few toes, maybe, if I haven't already. I think in more, believing that person, sort of accusing the victim, I think sometimes the person doing that might think that they're somehow being righteous because whatever the scenario is that the victim was involved with, they don't see themselves as ever getting wrapped up into. So, that happens to those kind of people over there, but not to me. And I think that might be when you deal with things like grooming and sexual abuse, people are like, well, there's sex involved and that's adultery and I would never be. So I think there's an element of maybe self-righteous or indignation that is not really appropriate, but is coming out in this person. So that's a guess. I've seen that. So there's some unintentional ignorance as to the depth of the problem of evil, and then not really holding themselves accountable to grow and learn in these areas. And I see that as when I teach the problem of evil course at my university, and I'll get pastors in there, I'll get apologetic students in there. And when they encounter some of the stories that we read about the depths of human evil, they don't know how to respond. It's so gruesome. So I think we as a church actually need to help train people in the reality of evil in this world, in the church, so that we can become better responders to people, so that we don't, our first reaction is not disbelief, like that doesn't happen, but that we go, yeah, actually people are pretty bad and I can see this. So my last thing I'll say, and I've given a lot, is that in my own experience, again, there's a little bit of selfish motivation in that when a person responds negatively, sometimes it seeks comfort for the hearer rather than comfort for the sufferer. So those quick answers that I call kind of easy bake oven.
Yeah.
That's so that I can be okay, not so that I can minister to you. And if you experience that, being able to say, oh, this person's not comfortable with this story, with what I'm telling them, and so they're backing out, or they're accusing me, I think it's not right, but it can help the victim understand what's going on in that scenario so that they don't maybe experience abuse all over again, or the trauma all over again from that moment. So those are some of the kinds of things I would think to consider about why do people respond this way when they hear about reports of abuse. There's a spectrum of what's going on in there.
Yeah. Yeah. One other point that I think of is, and it kind of wraps a little bit of that together, people responding from what they know and just kind of what has been good for them. If there's someone who has had a better experience. So they're like, well, this worked for me. And it's okay to share that. If you're like, well, this worked for me, so maybe it would work for you, but stated maybe with that humility of, I'm not sure, it just was good for me. Yeah. But I really appreciate these different takes on it. And you're right. It's going to depend on the person. There's going to be different motivators. The insight you offered into that kind of self-righteousness and that maybe judgments that is being made on maybe the character of the person who's sharing, maybe their behavior, like sort of this, well, what part did you have to play in that? And maybe they did have a part to play in that. It's not necessarily the time for that conversation, if it's the case. And for anyone who is listening, who's supporting someone, who loves someone who has suffered in these ways that we're talking about, I just want to give you just let you off the hook. You're not going to be able to fix it.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to, quote unquote, heal them.
Yeah.
You can be with them though, through it. I think that is the really important part, is that we're willing to say, I'm not really sure. And I'm probably going to do some stuff that's wrong or say some things that are wrong. I want to know if that's the case. Please tell me, because I want to learn. I also want you to know, though, that I'm here. So if it's too much or too little, or it's, communicate with me. Like, I just, I want to learn how to be a friend to you through this, but I don't really know. And I'm probably going to say something that's triggering, or that, and not to use that word lightly, but when I say triggering, I'm talking about a full-blown re-traumatic, like trauma response in the body. So we have this trauma response reflex that happens within our body. All this stuff happens. I'm not going to get into it. You can hear me talk about that later, but a lot of parts of our body get involved. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, oh, I didn't like that. I'm talking about, no, your body is actually responding to it in a way that's throwing you for a loop. So being able to acknowledge, I'm not fully equipped here, but I care. Yeah. And so I'm here in it, versus kind of, I got a lot of the like, back away slowly. I don't really know how to respond to that. Sometimes that was better than maybe what would have happened otherwise. But, ultimately God has shown up, and I'm so grateful. I'm thankful for him doing that. And I believe that he offers that to everyone. So
I like what you brought there. So I sort of focused on the negative aspect of why people respond negatively. And I like that you said, that doesn't have to be the case. You can say, hey, I'm not skilled in this. And I've had to say that several times, like, I have no experience with, and then I'll tell them whatever it is that they're talking to me about. But I'm okay listening and being there, because I we're all different. So we don't have the same experiences, but we all suffer. So we all know pain. We all know misery. We all know at different levels, there's trauma that we experience. So there's an empathy that we can give.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think we have evidence that taking a break from attending a church is a sin? I want to ask that because people can really struggle with that of, I'm not a part of a church community right now. And it's alarming. They're stressed. They're like, I've got to get back in, but they physically feel like they can't Because again, they're dissociating, they're shutting down, all kinds of stuff's happening. That's in a mental health area. It can be quite dangerous, honestly. Someone is dissociating for days at a time. It can go into a multiple personality situation. Lots of stuff can actually happen.
Yeah.
But they're like, but I'm supposed to be in church. So I'm wondering what maybe theologically you could bring into the conversation there.
Yeah. So I'm not gonna address the psychology side that you brought up, because I'm just not skilled in that.
Mm-hmm.
But I will, like you've asked, I'll do a little bit of the theology side. So I'm going to ask a person that's saying, is it a sin to take a break? I'm going to ask some framing and defining questions if I heard that said that it is a sin, or if they were asking me. And one of the things I'm actually going to ask is, well, what do you mean by church? A church? What if I take a break from the church or a church? Because I have a sneaky suspicion that they mean something like a 20th or 21st century American church. And possibly evangelical, because we really stress that being at the church every time the doors are open. And that's not technically the same thing as the church in the New Testament. It's a development from it, but it's not the same thing. So to sort of make a direct line to passages in the New Testament saying, hey, you always need to be there, I don't think is a good thing. So you need to say, what do you mean by the church? Because the church is the body of Christ. So everybody in there. And then you have the local body of believers that you are in fellowship with. So to see, that's first, we need some definitions. Then the framing, how are they interpreting that Hebrews 10 passage? Because that's typically what this is coming from. And while I'm not a trained theologian, I would suggest checking this with some commentaries. I will say that as I read through this passage, where this tends to come from, the do not forsake the coming together. I'll say that the author in that whole section is carefully attending to the inability of the law to free us from sin, which is what Christ's sacrifice did for us. So the reasoning of the author for drawing together of the believers here is out of a gratefulness for the reality of their freedom to be able to encourage each other in love and good works. So if the passage is sort of being used as a litmus test for piety, I think people have missed the boat here, or they've gotten off on the wrong track. It looks like a reminder of how much we need each other because of the shared forgiveness we have. And that serves as a great hope for us in the world full of evil. So in short, no, I don't think it's necessarily a sin. But then again, if you say you don't need community, now you're going to go against Paul's letter in the 1 Corinthians letter in chapter 12, where he does tell us we need each other, and the reasons for that. So, and then again, going back to what is the nature of God being community? So I think we need to wrestle with, if you say I don't need the church at all, I'm not just taking a break because of my experiences so that I can get myself to a point where I'm experiencing some healing, where maybe I'm not having those visceral reactions. But if you're saying, I never want to be a part of this again and I don't need it, almost as if that's your theology, that's what I think you need to wrestle with, because that's not going to be found or supported in the Bible. But taking a break might be about rest. It might be about listening to God rather than listening to people who might be theologically and emotionally underdeveloped, might be sin-laden and self-righteous, trying to put others under their spiritual thumb. So it might be taking a break from that, because some of that's going on. And taking a break from the 21st century American church is not the same thing as breaking all fellowship with the body of Christ. So where I would caution is in the theology, and then also in the habits, because humans are habit forming. So if you take an extended break and there's nothing that you miss about the church, it's time to sort of revisit that. What's going on there?
I appreciate you drawing that distinction about what the kind of church building, our Sunday rhythm, ritual that we have in our culture, that's not all encompassing of being a part of the Big C church, as we would call it, the body of Christ being the Big C church. So yeah, there is a distinction there. And we see in other countries, people aren't gathering in the same way we are, either because they can or because it's not their culture. And so it looks different. So yes, there can be some room for that. And I appreciate you again, drawing that distinction. And sometimes taking a break is kind of getting our footing of what on earth should I be looking for? How do I, like some of the tips you shared in the beginning of, I should look at the leadership structure. Okay, all right, I'm going to take a look at that. I'm going to check out some things online maybe first. I'm going to want to meet someone for coffee and ask some questions. And so as someone is learning maybe for the first time or relearning ways to decide, is this a real Christian community or maybe is it not? Because not all of them are today. Not just today, but historically as well. Nothing new under the sun. So just things look a little bit different, but it's kind of the same. So it's okay to step back and take some time to do that. I do recommend that if people are like, I just need to, I don't know about the Christianity thing. I don't know. That's a big part of why beEmboldened is here, is for people to be able to reach out and connect virtually or in person, depending on the details. And it's an option to just be able to ask questions. And so you're not isolated, but you're not getting quote unquote plugged in, either where you're like, I'm making this really big commitment, just a very low commitment. And I really appreciate how people they'll follow along with our resources for months and then they'll reach out because they were able to establish, okay, I feel comfortable. I feel there's some trust that has been built. And so now I can have a conversation. And Mary Jo, I know that happens to you where you go to conferences and you you're teaching on what you teach on, a lot about your story and all that has come out of it, and all you've done with it, all the learning and education that's come. And you're sharing about these things. And you've got people coming up to you sharing about what they've suffered, how that's been for them, because trust has been built. They've been following along. They've been listening. And I think there's room for that. For us to say, I'm going to observe for a little while, and then I'm going to engage. I'm going to start asking questions. And I think if we do it too quickly, again, we could be at risk of landing ourselves from one boiling pot of water into another one. So I completely agree. I would support everything Mary Jo said. Don't go isolate yourself. One last just interesting point is, physiologically, we have a neuropeptide that's released in our body. And Mary Jo, you might find this interesting. It's released in our body when we have a trauma response. The negative impact of that neuropeptide is heightened when we isolate.
Oh,
isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
How our bodies were created.
Yeah. That helps that, I need community to get out of my mind.
Yeah. But
kind of idea.
But oftentimes we do want to isolate. Some of us don't. Some of us are like, we want to go talk to someone. We tell everyone our story and because we're trying to make sense of it. And some of us are like, no, I want to shut down and pull back. So I think it speaks to how we were created. We're avoiding the isolation, leaning in is actually it's going to help us in the long run. So just determining who's the safe person to do that with. Yeah. Again, maybe not the perfect person. Maybe they're not going to say all the right things, but who can I trust in that situation? So
I'm glad you shared that, because I think a lot of people avoid community out of shame. And that isolation can continue that thought and they need the community to see that idea that there is no temptation that is not common to man. Like everybody's struggling with things, and the shame may not be there. It's just that they're, the trauma of being a victim. And yet they still feel the shame associated with it, even if they were a victim of something. Yeah. And so being in community can help pull them out of that mindset and let them see that they're greatly loved and that they're respected for who they are. And I think that gets lost when you've been victimized, is that you lose that idea that you're worthy of love and respect.
Mm. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. The shame can pop up, even if it doesn't make sense to us. It still shows up.
Yeah.
Kind of work that through. Yeah, I've absolutely had that happen. I've felt that shame of the family I come from sometimes. And it can get in the way of me doing what I do, or, gets in my head of like, I'm just the daughter of a cult leader. I mean, but I'm not just the daughter of a cult leader, so like you have to catch it though and kind of debunk it in your own mind. And so, yes, renewing our minds, focusing on truth is really, really important too. In this journey. So what would you suggest as other options for individuals to get their feet under them? I know I was just mentioning that, hey, if you don't feel like you're walking into a church anytime soon, you need some time, you're taking that break. What else can it look like to begin to learn, okay, what do I believe? Why do I believe it? How do I determine what's true and what's not? How do I go about this process so I feel like I can step into a body of Christ?
Yeah. You've mentioned some things like getting involved with beEmboldened, where you're, starting to explore a ministry that's purposed to help you get back towards community. But then there's also like, if you don't feel comfortable going to a church, you could do a Bible study. Is there a Bible study group in your neighborhood or somewhere in the area? If not, maybe there's the potential to have teaching at your house where you're the host, so that you have some semblance or feeling of control over how things are going to go. So you don't feel like you're completely throwing yourself into a situation where you can't control. But having that just a little bit of element of control in the environment might help ease you back into relationship in the church community. So maybe hosting teaching at your own home, or if you're a skilled teacher, maybe teaching from your house and creating your own group there that you guys can explore the Bible together as a means of being, an entry back into the broader Christian community.
Mm. Something I did as well was I found people that, again, I had followed along for a while and find, okay, I can trust what they're saying. Again, I don't shut my brain off, but I respect what they have to say. And then if you're connected on social media, things like that, who are they following? Whose stuff are they sharing? And so I found that to be really helpful to find other people that I can then, follow along with as well and learn from. And that's been a great resource for me. So, and you're one of those people. So again, I'm just so honored to have you here. I am deeply grateful for how genuine you are willing to be and how realistic you are about what this looks like. Oh. It's incredibly, incredibly helpful. So for anyone who is not following Mary Jo, has not read her book, she is, I would say it's, that can you be safe being where you're at and following Mary Jo? Yeah, you can. Because she gets it in her way. And there's an intersection there, again, that I think connects us together. So I'd highly recommend anything that she and her husband, Roger, are doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I always feel like I'm so academic and so high-minded and theologically minded, but we all need community, even us academic types.
Yeah. And even those of us who don't want it for a period of time or don't feel like they can have it for a period of time, usually they do want it. We desire it. It's just being so afraid to step out and find it and get burned again.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, one of the things that was a problem for me was within my academic life, there's a focus on production of content. And I would say that might be true for people who have an online presence as well. There's production of content. And so that can lead to sort of an underdeveloped emotional side. We're not really paying attention to your maturity. And that, that's another reason that I don't condemn people for needing a break. I don't condemn people for desiring community, but not being able to find that. How do I step into that? Because sometimes with the way we live our American lifestyles, we've spent all of our time in content production, whether that's our jobs, raising kids or whatever it is. And we really haven't had that time or intentionality to develop the other parts that can maybe have the language or the response for when we're in these situations that are harder, that are emotionally hard.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. Would you mind closing us out with any final words of encouragement for people who are like, okay, maybe I'm going to take this on, or I have been, but I'm feeling tired. Like I think you opened by saying that, like it's wearing.
Yeah.
So anything that you would offer?
Yeah, there's a passage of scripture that really speaks to me greatly in my times of like trouble and suffering, to remind me to be kinder to myself, because I'm prone to beat myself up for not arriving at whatever point I think I should be at. So it's kind of an odd connection to what we've been talking about, but I hope you'll see it. From Matthew 23, you've got a section of scripture where Jesus is proclaiming all these woes to the religious leaders in Jerusalem. I mean, he's calling them some bad stuff, like they're hypocrites, vipers, murderers. He even says the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. Pretty bad stuff.
Yeah.
Then what does he say? Immediately after that, he says, how often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. So listen to the compassion that Jesus has, even for the worst kinds of human beings. So what I would say is, in saying be kinder to yourself, remember, if Jesus loves those kind of worst kinds of humans who are doing the worst things with such passion, with such care of like a mother hen wanting to protect her children, he definitely cares that way for you.